Flight from Tommorow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jerome Lawson, July 2008. Flight from Tommorow, by H. Beam Piper. Hunted and hated in two worlds, Hradzka dreamed of a monomaniac's glory, stranded in the past with his knowledge of the future. But he didn't know the past quite well enough. 1. But yesterday, a whole planet had shouted, "Hail Hradzka! Hail the leader!" Today they were screaming, "Death to Hradzka! Kill the tyrant!" The palace, where Hradzka, surrounded by his sycophants and guards, had lorded it over a solar system, was now an inferno. Those who had been too closely identified with the dictator's rule to hope for forgiveness were fighting to the last, seeking only a quick death in combat. One by one, their isolated points of resistance were being wiped out. The corridors and chambers of the huge palace were thronged with rebels, loud with their shouts, and with the rasping hiss of heat beams and the crash of blasters, reeking with the stench of scorched plastic and burned flesh, of hot metal and charred fabric. The living quarters were overrun. The mob smashed down walls and tore up floors in search of secret hiding places. They found strange things. The spaceship that had been built under one of the domes, in readiness for flight to the still loyal colonies of Mars or the asteroid belt, for instance. But Hradzka himself they could not find. At last, the search reached the new tower which reared its head 5,000 feet above the palace, the highest thing in the city. They blasted down the huge steel doors, cut the power from the energy screens. They landed from anti-grav cars on the upper levels, but except for barriers of metal and concrete and energy, they met with no opposition. Finally they came to a spiral stairway which led up to the great metal sphere which capped the whole structure. General Zarvis, the army commander who had placed himself at the head of the revolt, stood with his foot on the lowest step, his followers behind him. There was Prince Burvanny, the leader of the old nobility, and Gorzesko Orm, the merchant, and between them stood Tobe, the chieftain of the mutinous slaves. There were clerks, laborers, poor but haughty nobles, and wealthy merchants who had long been forced to hide their riches from the dictator's tax gatherers and soldiers and spacemen. "You better let one of us go first, sir," General Zarvis orderly, a blood-stained bandage about his head, his uniform in rags, suggested. "You don't know what might be up there." The general shook his head. "I'll go first." Zarvis Pol was not the man to send subordinates into danger ahead of himself. "To tell the truth, I'm afraid we won't find anything at all up there." "You mean?" Gorzesko Orm began. "The time machine," Zarvis Pol replied. "If he's managed to get it finished, the Great Mind only knows where he may be now. Or when." He loosened the blaster in his holster and started up the long spiral. His followers spread out. Below, sharpshooters took position to cover his ascent. Prince Burvanny and Tobe the slave started to follow him. They hesitated as each motioned the other to precede him. Then the nobleman followed the general, his blaster drawn, and the brawny slave behind him. The door at the top was open, and Zarvis Pol stepped through, but there was nothing in the great spherical room except a raised dais some 50 feet in diameter, its polished metal top strangely clean and empty, and a crumpled heap of burned cloth and charred flesh that had been, not long ago, a man. An old man with a white beard and the 7-pointed star of the Learned Brothers on his breast advanced to meet the armed intruders. "So he is gone, Kradzi-Zago?" Zarvis Pol said, holstering his weapon. "Gone in the time machine, to hide in yesterday or tomorrow? And you let him go?" The old one nodded. "He had a blaster, and I had none." He indicated the body on the floor. "Zoldy Jarv had no blaster either, but he tried to stop Hradzka. See, he squandered his life as a fool squanders his money, getting nothing for it. And a man's life is not money, Zarvis Pol." "I do not blame you, Kradzi-Zago," General Zarvis said. "But now you must get to work, and build us another time machine, so that we can hunt him down." "Does revenge mean so much to you, then?" The soldier made an impatient gesture. "Revenge is for fools, like that screaming pack of beasts below. I do not kill for revenge. I kill because dead men do no harm." "Hradzka will do us no more harm," the old scientist replied. "He is a thing of yesterday, of a time long past and half lost in the mists of legend."
No matter, as long as he exists, at any point in space-time. Hradzka is still a threat. Revenge means much to Hradzka. He will return for it, when we least expect him.
The old man shook his head. "No, Zarvas Pol. Hradzka will not return." Hradzka holstered his blaster, threw the switch that sealed the time machine, put on the anti-grav unit, and started the time shift unit. He reached out and set the destination dial for the mid-52nd century of the atomic era. That would land him in the ninth age of chaos, following the two-century war and the collapse of the world theocracy. A good time for his purpose. The world would be slipping back into barbarism, and yet possess the technology of former civilizations. 100 little national states would be trying to gain social stability, competing and warring with each other. Hradzka glanced back over his shoulder at the cases of books, record spools, tridimensional pictures, and scale models. These people of the past would welcome him in his science of the future, would make him their leader. He would start in a small way, by taking over the local feudal or tribal government, would arm his followers with weapons of the future. Then he would impose his rule upon neighboring tribes, or princedoms, or communes, or whatever, and build a strong sovereignty. From that he envisioned a world empire, a solar system empire. Then he would build time machines, many time machines. He would recruit an army such as the universe had never seen, a swarm of men from every age in the past. At that point he would return to the 100th century of the atomic era, to wreak vengeance upon those who had risen against him. A thin smile grew on Hradzka's thin lips as he thought of the tortures with which he would put Zarvas Pol to death. He glanced up at the great disk of the indicator and frowned. Already he was back to the year 7500 AE, and the temporal displacement had begun to slow. The disk was turning even more rapidly. 7,000, 6,000, 5,500. He gasped slightly. Then he had passed his destination. He was now in the 40th century, but the indicator was slowing. The hairline crossed the 30th century, the 20th, the 15th, the 10th. He wondered what had gone wrong, but he had recovered from his fright by this time. When the insane machine stopped, as it must around the 1st century of the atomic era, he would investigate, make repairs, then shift forward to his target point. Hradzka was determined upon the 52nd century. He had made a special study of the history of that period, had learned the language spoken then, and he understood the methods necessary to gain power over the natives of that time. The indicator disc came to a stop in the 1st century. He switched on the magnifier and leaned forward to look. He had emerged into normal time in the year 10 of the atomic era, a decade after the first uranium pile had gone into operation, and 7 years after the first atomic bombs had been exploded in warfare. The altimeter showed that he was hovering at 8,000 feet above ground level. Slowly, he cut out the antigrav, letting the time machine down easily. He knew that there had been no danger of materializing inside anything. The new tower had been built to put it above anything that had occupied that space point at any moment within history, or legend, or even the geological knowledge of man. What lay below, however, was uncertain. It was night. The visi-screen showed only a star-dusted, moonless sky and dark shadows below. He snapped another switch. For a few microseconds a beam of intense light was turned on, automatically photographing the landscape under him. A second later, the developed picture was projected upon another screen. It showed only wooded mountains and a barren, brush-grown valley. The time machine came to rest with a soft jar and a crashing of broken bushes that was audible through the sound pickup. Hradzka pulled the main switch. There was a click as the shielding went out and the door opened. A breath of cool night air drew into the hollow sphere. Then there was a loud bang inside the mechanism, and a flash of blue-white light which turned to pinkish flame with a nasty crackling. Curls of smoke began to rise from the square black box that housed the time-shift mechanism, and from behind the instrument board. In a moment, everything was glowing hot. Driblets of aluminum and silver were running down the instruments. Then the whole interior of the time machine was afire. There was barely time for Hradzka to leap through the open door.